Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 Senate elections. I'll be giving you all my updated prediction on these races. I last did this in, I believe, early August, so it's now time for an update. And we have a lot of new polling data, we have a lot of new fundraising data, so let's get into it. We're going to begin, as we always do, by filling out our states that are going to be safe for the Democratic Party. Then we're going to go over to the Republicans. So for now, Democrats, as you can see, are going to start out in a very weak position where they're only, even when you give them their safe seats, they're only at 39. But Republicans, on the other hand, they have a significant number of safe seats, in addition to the fact that they're starting out, I believe, with 38 seats just guaranteed. So they're starting out, when you add in the safe seats, at 47. I'm also going to put Virginia likely Democratic, but it's one of the safest likely seats you're going to see, so we're not going to talk about it today. So essentially, we've got 40 Democrats guaranteed to win re-election or head to the Senate, and 47 Republicans to win re-election or head to the Senate. So Republicans start out with a huge advantage in this chamber, and really, it's going to be difficult for them to lose the Senate this year because they have such a huge advantage in terms of this map and the seats that are up for election this year. So we're going to get into it with our likely Democratic states, and we're going to start in New Mexico. We do have a bit of polling data, which I like, and the polling data hasn't really been anything too surprising. If we take a look at the recent polls, we have Martin Heinrich, the Democrat, leading Nella Dominici by 12, 10. In one Redfield poll, he was only up by 6. But Heinrich won by a very good amount in 2018. I think he won by 20 points. But the polling data does show that he's lost a bit of support since then. He's actually not even polling at 50%. So I'm moving this down to likely just out of an abundance of caution, but I don't really think that this seat's going to be competitive and that Republicans obviously aren't going to invest in winning New Mexico. Democrats are also going to be in the likely column in the state of Maryland. This race has admittedly been closer than I thought it would be because, again, the polling data we've gotten a couple of polls here. The polling data has actually been very good for Larry Hogan. They actually started out with a Fabrizio and Lee poll in early August or in the middle of August that showed Kamala Harris winning Maryland by 33, but had Larry Hogan tied with a 33-point ticket split. Since then, we've gotten, polls that have showed better results for also Brooks, but, in the past really 5 polls, or even the past 4 since Joe Biden dropped out, right, like they've all been within single digits, and the highest quality pollster we've had here is Emerson, and they only have also Brooks up by 7. Now, there are a lot of undecided voters, and those undecided voters are likely, very strong majority Democrats. But again, in this case, Maryland, to me, it's the fact that we even have close polling is worth talking about. So it's going to be likely for now. If we start seeing 15, 20-point leads for also Brooks come October and November, I could put this back in the safe column, but I will, for just for now, keep it likely because the polls do show a close race. Now, as I was talking about Maryland, I remember that I forgot to briefly mention Nebraska's Senate race, which I actually made a full video about. But essentially, in the polls, the independent candidate Dan Osborne is actually pretty close to Deb Fischer. It's kind of the reverse Maryland because we have, in Nebraska, it's an independent versus a Republican. Maryland, it's a moderate Republican versus Democrat. But what we've seen is that we have races in very partisan states the other way where the polls show it close, right? Like Dan Osborne's only down by 1 here. He's only down by 2 here. But at the same time, there's a lot of undecided voters. No one's really close to 50%. So it's a race we're talking about in the same way Maryland is. But I think both these races could go to the safe column for the other part, or for the party likely to win them before we get to October and November. Now, the next 2 states are going to be, for the Democrats in the likely column, now that I've gotten Nebraska out of the way, are going to be Montana. It's really not my day. Minnesota and Wisconsin. So these 2 states are going to be a bit different. Minnesota will likely vote for Amy Klobuchar by a lot more than Wisconsin's going to vote for Tammy Baldwin. But just to briefly look at the polling here, in Minnesota, the result hasn't been amazing for Klobuchar. I think she'll likely win by, 12, 13 points, but she won by 24 in 2018. So she's still seeing a drop in support. And kind of the same thing happened to Heinrich in New Mexico, where these are 2 Democrats that won by big margins in the last time they were up for re-election. This time, I think with polarization setting in, with Trump turning out Republican, voters, it'll make the margin closer. Doesn't mean they really have any risk of losing, but the margins are going to go down. Now, in Wisconsin, obviously, what's interesting is that we are dealing with an election that does not seem to be narrowing up. And we've seen other states narrow up, like Pennsylvania, which we'll get into later in this video. But right now, in Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin has not relinquished her lead. In Redfield, she's up by 7. She's up by 7 in Morning Consult coefficient. This is a GOP poll. She's still up by 6. In Marquette, which is probably the best Wisconsin poll, and their likely voter, when they push undecided, she's up by 5. She's up by 6 in CNN. She's up by 5 in Redfield. She was only up by 1 in Emerson, but they, again, had Harris losing the state, which is possible, but, they've been pretty bearish on Democrats recently. And then Fabrizio and Ward, Fabrizio's Trump's pollster, they had Baldwin up by 5. So all the polls kind of show a mid to high single-digit victory for Tammy Baldwin here. And again, polls in Wisconsin have historically underestimated Democratic support, so I think maybe Baldwin only wins by 5 instead of 6, 7, or 8. But she's a popular incumbent. She won by 11 last time she was up for re-election. And Republicans have gained some traction, I think, in Pennsylvania, so that could divert funding from Wisconsin, and they could pour it into Pennsylvania, where they actually do seem to have a path to victory. Whereas, again, like in Wisconsin, it's one of those races where Republicans might have hoped to be competitive, but the polls have not turned out that way. So this state, I think, could very close to be being triaged by the Senate GOP, and they could just say, hey, look, we're not going to play here because we don't think, right? Like, we only need 4 seats to get to the majority. Wisconsin, we actually don't need that seat. So to me, that's a seat that I think could stay Democratic because of that. Now, to go over to the Republican column, now that we've kind of filled out the likely Democratic states here, we're going to start in Missouri, where this is a state that obviously Republicans are very likely to win, and I think Josh Hawley will have no problem winning re-election. But we have gotten some close polling. Like Emerson only had him up by 11. Change Research, which is a Democratic poll, only had him up by 5. And Democrats have been able to sponsor internal polls here, which shows that they think they have momentum. It doesn't mean they're close to winning Missouri. Obviously, this is a deeply Republican state, but it does show that they think they have momentum. And if and again, Josh Hawley is not a very popular senator, especially in the suburbs, right? And in 2022, we saw that a lot of Trumpian Republicans who denied the election result and were seen as right-wing actually underperformed. And that's why, for example, in swing states, Republicans lost most of those races. Now, the good news for Josh Hawley is that Missouri is not a swing state, and it's a deeply Republican state, and he's going to win re-election. But he's going to underperform Trump by a good amount, and I could see him winning by only 10 or 11 in a state that another Republican would have won by 16 or 17. And so for that reason, we're going to put it in the likely column just to, kind of let you all know about that. So, interestingly enough, that's actually going to be it for our likely Republican states. We're now going to go to our lean Democratic states. And these are the important states here, because I'm going to fill out 4 states as lean Democratic: Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So starting with Nevada, this is a state where Democrats have done incredibly well in the polling, almost unsustainably well. And we actually saw, in August, Jackie Rosen led by 18 points in one poll, 12 in another poll, 11 in this poll. And we still keep seeing those results. And even Trafalgar, which had Donald Trump winning the state in 2020, had Republicans winning the Senate race by 5 in 2022. They have Rosen up by 8. Redfield has her up by 8. She's up by 10 in Morning Consult. She's up by 9 in Insider Advantage. So all these polls, she's up by 10 in CNN. All the polls have her ahead, and by really, really big margins. Now, part of the reason that I'm skeptical about Kamala Harris in Nevada is that the polling there has been really good for Jackie Rosen, but for Harris, it's been kind of a wash. And in 2022, we saw Democrats outperform their polls here. But again, in 2020, Trump outperformed his polls. So Nevada, historically, polls have actually underestimated Democrats, but in 2020, we did see that precedent. It's possible for it to kind of reverse. And so that's why, I'm not saying this because I believe Jackie Rosen is favored to lose. She's a popular incumbent. She also has a massive spending advantage here, right? If we take a look at the money that she spent compared to Sam Brown, the Republican, in this race, the difference could not be bigger right now, right? Jackie Rosen, as the incumbent senator, has that advantage. And if we take a look here, she's raised $31 million. Sam Brown's raised $9 million. She's outspent him by $15 million, more than $15 million. So that's, I think, why she's up by so much. Trump's going to turn out Republicans. Nevada, Republicans have a high floor there. So I do believe the race will be closer than the polls suggest, but not a good look for Republicans that they're still down 9, 10 points in this race. Arizona is similar. The polling has been very bad for the GOP here. And again, Kari Lake, who's their candidate, is really not getting any traction. Trafalgar, which is a GOP poll, again, they had Blake Masters winning the Senate race here in 2022. They had Donald Trump winning the state by a good amount in 2020. They still have Gallego up by 4. And then in nonpartisan polls like Morning Consult, he's up by 8. He's up by 5 in another GOP poll, Insider Advantage. And then some of the better polls we've had, right, like the New York Times Siena poll from August, he was up by 9. So every poll in Arizona has shown Gallego ahead. I think we've seen one Kari Lake internal from like the beginning of the summer that had her winning. If I can, yeah, she was up by 1 in her internal from July 11th. But again, just kind of in general, the polls in Arizona, they've broadly been fine. In 2020, they underestimated Republicans, but in 2018, 2022, and 2016, they underestimated Democrats. Ruben Gallego's up by a good amount, and he's doing this while Kamala Harris is still losing in Arizona in the polls by a narrow amount. So he's outrunning Kamala Harris by a lot, and obviously that could be used as evidence for a polling miss because he's up by so much. But just the fact that he's outrunning her by so much shows that even if she does lose the state, Gallego is likely to win. Now, Michigan, to go over to the Rust Belt here, Democrats have been holding their ground here. This is an open seat where Republicans do have a path to victory. Mike Rogers is their candidate, and he's actually, I think, running one of the better campaigns of Republicans in 2022, especially compared to the really bad campaigns that have been run by the GOP in Arizona and Nevada, which is why they're losing by so much. Again, Michigan's bluer than both Arizona and Nevada, but their polls are a lot closer for Republicans. They're only down by 5 in Redfield. They were down by 9 in Morning Consult, Rogers was. But again, YouGov 7, doable. And Slotkin's only at 48. Signal only had Slotkin up by 1. Glenn Gariff had her up by 9. Emerson had her up by 6. So, we've kind of seen a mixed bag for Republicans. Some polls have it close, some polls don't. But the average is probably a mid-single digits lead for Alessa Slotkin, which is kind of fair and what you'd expect. The good news for the GOP is that historically the polls have underestimated Democrats, or have underestimated Republicans here, in Michigan. So that's going to mean a lot for them because if, right now they're down by, say, 5 on average, a 2016 or 2020 level polling error would put that right in the state of play. Now, I'm not a huge fan of using past polling errors to predict future misses because it's historically been wrong to do that. But I do believe that given the precedent that's been so overwhelming in Michigan, it's worth noting. With that being said, this is a state that I believe will vote for Kamala Harris. Alessa Slotkin is relatively popular here. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to matter. And so I do expect her to win. Republicans also haven't won federally here since 2016 when Donald Trump won. So they haven't really given us any reason to be confident in them. Now, Pennsylvania, this is an interesting one. Again, in July or June, I might have said this race was likely Democratic, but we've seen some very close polls. Insider Advantage, Casey's only up by 5. He's only up by 4 in Suffolk, which, by the way, had Harris up by 3. So Casey's only doing 1% better than Kamala Harris, by the way, which is really interesting. Redfield had Casey up by 8. He was up by 9 in Morning Consult. Coefficient had him up by 9. YouGov had him up by 7. Then we got from Wick a Casey plus 2 poll. So the polls have been narrowing a little bit. And kind of the fundraising here, as we can see, the interesting thing for Republicans is that once I can pull this up, I can show you. The interesting thing for Republicans is that as of late, they've had a bit of momentum in terms of the cash flow here. And Dave McCormick is catching up to Bob Casey in terms of money raised. Casey still has $13.5 million more raised, and he spent, roughly the same amount more than McCormick, but the gap is closing. And McCormick is a, very wealthy individual who's going to be able to fund his campaign a bit more in the final months. So again, this race, I do think Democrats have an advantage. Bob Casey's a popular incumbent, but Pennsylvania, it could vote for Trump. And if Republicans get the turnout they need, it could be just enough to get a very narrow victory for Dave McCormick, who could actually likely outrun Donald Trump in the suburbs. But again, Casey's the popular incumbent. He still has the, structural advantages here. And I do believe he'll outrun Harris by a couple points. That should be enough to hold on in Pennsylvania. Now, you've got 4 states left. Democrats, actually either party needs 2 if they win the presidency. Either party needs 3 if they lose the presidency. But the good news for Republicans is that they're going to get 2 right now, in Florida and in Texas. So these 2 states have been, polling a bit closer as of late, but I still believe Republicans are going to hold on. If we start out in Florida, where polls have actually shown somewhat of a close race between Debbie Merkersel-Powell and Rick Scott, Redfield only had Scott up by 3, but in the better polls, Morning Consult's Q was up by 5. He was up by 3 in a Democratic internal. So that obviously is very interesting. Now, the poll that caused a lot of panic for Republicans was Emerson, which only had Scott up by 1. But you have a lot of undecided voters that are likely to break for him And again, in Florida, the polls have historically underestimated Republicans, and Scott in 2018 was down in the polls. He ended up beating out an incumbent Democrat. Florida's a redder state in 2024 than it was in 2018, and Trump's likely to carry the state by, I'd say, maybe around 5, potentially more points. And that will be a huge boost to Rick Scott in this state. And again, he's the incumbent. Debbie Merkersol Powell has raised a good amount of money, but Scott has a lot of cash on hand. And this race should, I believe, kind of, once we get close to Election Day, start to move back towards the GOP. Now, Texas, I do think will actually be closer than Florida, even though the polls have actually been a bit less close. But again, Ted Cruz is a polarizing incumbent. A lot of people in Texas really like him. A lot of people really don't like him. Democrats especially really don't like Ted Cruz. That's why Colin Alexis been able to raise so much money. But at the end of the day, Texas is a red state. Trump's likely to win it by, I'd say, 5 points, kind of similar to Florida, maybe a bit less. And the polls do favor Ted Cruz, right? Morning Consult, he's up by 5. He's up by 4 in Emerson. He's up by 8 in the YouGov polls. So the polls do show him ahead, relatively comfortably. And at the end of the day, that's what matters, right? Because if Republicans were actually in a toss-up race here, we'd see polls that show it actually, as a tie, maybe with Democrats ahead. We haven't gotten that yet. Democrats, I don't think that that they buy that Allred can actually win. I think he can come close. But Ted Cruz, again, he won in 2018 in a very blue year. And Democrats, Texas, I'd say maybe relative to the country, has gotten bluer since 2018. But certainly, 2024 will not be a year as blue as 2018, and that's going to really hurt Democratic turnout in Texas relative to Republican turnout, because if Ted Cruz won in that electorate, he can certainly win in a presidential electorate where Donald Trump's getting out rural voters who are going to vote Republican up and down the ticket. So the GOP, they need one more seat to win a majority here, and we're going to give them Montana now. Now, Montana, this is a state that Democrats have been getting very worried about their chances in. Again, they do have an incumbent, Jon Tester, and Jon Tester won most recently in 2018 with just 50% of the vote. But he's been close all 3 times. He's won 3 terms. All 3 have been very close. And Republicans, I think, have their best shot yet to knock him out. So we did get a Fabrizio poll, but again, they collaborated with David Binder, which I believe is actually Democratic Alliance. So it was, I'd say, pretty fair, balanced out. And when they pushed undecided, they found Jon Tester down by 6 to Tim Sheehy, the Republican, which is a huge concern for Tester. We saw a GOP-aligned poll had Tester down by 7. He was up by 5 in an RMG poll, which was weirdly good for him. But beyond that, right, Emerson had him down by 2 in August as well. So all but one poll shows Tester behind. It's a state that Trump's likely to win by 15 points at the top of the ticket, right? And at the end of the day, the big problem Democrats have in these Republican states is that they used to be able to win them because rural voters were fine voting for Democrats down ballot. Democrats used to represent, they used to hold both seats in West Virginia. They used to hold a seat in North Dakota, in Indiana, in Missouri. And Montana's kind of, kind of like, I'd say one of the vestiges of that Democratic coalition where Democrats used to win over rural voters. And this is their last stand in Montana. And they're likely to lose here because the polls have them down. Jon Tester's approval ratings have gone down drastically even over the course of the past year because Republicans have attacked him on the airwaves. And they've called him out for being, for voting mostly with Joe Biden, for being a kind of generic Democrat on the issues. And in Montana, generic Democrats are not popular. It's why it's a conservative state. So Jon Tester, I think, he could come close to winning, but it's going to be very difficult to see him actually pulling it off because Montana is such a conservative state, because Trump's likely to win it by 15 points at the top of the ticket. Do you think 15% of people in Montana are going to, vote for Trump and then turn around and vote for Jon Tester? I think maybe 5 or 7% of them will, but not 15%. And in 2018, when Tester won by 3, Democrats only lost the House popular vote by 7. So he even in 2018 in a midterm, he only outran the top of the ticket by 10. This year, he'd have to outrun it by probably 14, 15, or 16 to win. So very difficult to see him winning here. Now, our final race is Ohio. This is a state I've gone back and forth on, and I'm going to put it back in the GOP column. Now, last time I did have it in the tilt Democratic column because we got a lot of good polling for Sherrod Brown, and Sherrod Brown still leads in the polls. I'll pull it up right now. As you can see, he does still lead, but they've gotten closer, and Emerson only had him up by 1. And Democrats are in dangerous territory now because, again, in Ohio, historically, the polls have all across the board, even in 2022, or actually, not in 2022, actually, but in 2016, 2018, and 2020, we saw the polls underestimate Republicans drastically. In 2022, the polls are pretty accurate in Ohio. I think they only underestimated Tim Ryan by like half a point. But again, these polls, what we usually see is that Republicans are tied with Democrats. They're both 45 or 46%, that the undecided voters on Election Day break massively in favor of the GOP. So if that happens this time, let's just look at this morning consult poll. Brown can get 46 or 47, but if the undecideds break towards Moreno the way they historically have broken for Republicans in Ohio, he'd still win. Same thing with Emerson. Brown's only at 46. Now, this GOP-aligned poll from Red Eagle Politics and On Point Politics, who I believe are two, I know Red Eagle Politics is an election forecasting YouTube. I think On Point Politics is as well. They did find Sherrod Brown up by 5, but, I'm not really going to use that for or against Brown. It's kind of a, it's kind of like if I went to a grocery store and asked 20 people who they're going to vote for in my state Senate race, that wouldn't be a great poll. But, looking at other higher quality polls, Fabrizio and Lee, Brown wins, he's leading, but he's only at 46. So the common theme is that Sherrod Brown does lead Bernie Moreno, but he's only, at 45, 46, 47% of the vote. And we saw the same thing with Tim Ryan in 2022, where early on he led, but again, as we got close to election day, Republicans surged, and we could start seeing that soon. And again, even if the polls do remain like this on election day, I think you can make a very good case for Moreno winning, because again, Sherrod Brown in Ohio as an incumbent senator only at 46% of the vote. Undecideds are likely to skew Republican. That is going to make it very difficult for Democrats to hold on here. So that's going to wrap up the video. Republicans are going to win 52 Senate seats. Democrats are going to win 48 as of right now. The Democrats, obviously, Ohio is their best bet to get to seat 49, but to get to seat 50, they need to likely win, I would say, Texas before Montana. And then Florida would be the 52nd seat, but at that point, you're kind of in best case scenario territory. Republicans have a really high ceiling here because they can win if we see, a good year for them in November, or a good election night for them. They could maybe come back and win Pennsylvania and Michigan. Maybe they pull off a big upset in one of Nevada or Arizona. But again, this map is so favorable to them because all they have to do is just win back Montana and hold on to Texas and Florida, and that's it. Or if they lose Montana, they can still win Ohio. So as of right now, that's my prediction. Let me know what you all think, and I will see you all in the next video.